Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. I've been thinking a little bit about Korea. I actually have done some reading over the past couple of years, and the cold. It's cold here in Utah right now, and the cold always gets me thinking about two things: the Battle of the Bulge and Chosun in Korea, and what the men suffered in those two battles. Jim, how did we end up with two Koreas?
Well, it was supposed to be a temporary solution to the end of World War II. The United States came in from the south after occupying Japan, and the Russians had already invaded Manchuria, and they were standing by, and they moved into North Korea. At the time, the Russians thought they got the better part of the deal, which they did, because most of the industry that the Japanese had built up in their 40 years of occupation was in the north. The south was a breadbasket, as it were, but they grew a lot of food. The Russians believed they could unite the entire country under communist rule, and in 1950 they ordered Kim Jong-il to invade. They supplied him with a lot of modern weapons. He had a lot of Korean troops who had basically, a lot of them were ethnic Koreans from China, but they had all had combat experience. Kim himself was a communist, functionary, as it were, who had spent some time in Russia, was trusted to follow orders, etc. And they did. And at first they were successful. Unfortunately, for all of our problems, we struck back. And within a few months, the North Koreans were rapidly scampering across the DMZ, or the 30th parallel, which is roughly what the DMZ is, back to North Korea. At that point, Russia called in its last favor from China. Chinese said this after they had a few years of fighting in Korea. And the Chinese, who had just finished their civil war that ended in 1949, and really hadn't demobilized a lot of the units they had formed. So they took a lot of the nationalist units who had surrendered and switched sides. Well, we can't trust these guys anyway, so let's send them into Korea. But they also sent a lot of sons of prominent Chinese officials, including Mao Zedong. And that son got killed, as did a lot of other sons. There were several 100,000 Chinese killed in 3 years of fighting. It was a stalemate. The United States was not willing to make a major effort, which would have killed a lot of Americans and Allied troops. In fact, because the Russians were having how should I put it, a disagreement with the UN, they were not present, because they had a veto. They were not present on the day of the invasion or soon after the invasion. And they were not able to veto a UN vote that basically approved of a UN force under the direction of the United States, who would supply most of their troops, to go in and liberate South Korea. And I don't think they had orders to unite Korea, but the South Koreans were very eager to do that and eliminate the northern threat once and for all. And off they went. MacArthur was brilliant.
Now, Jim, one of the things that happened at just before the beginning of the Korean War is, I'm trying to remember his name. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but whoever was Secretary of State at the time made an unfortunate statement of what was United States interest, and it did not include Korea.
Yes, that was before the invasion.
Right.
And so, like Kuwait in 1990, that faux pas, we repeated ourselves in 1990, seemed to green light the invasion that would be uninterrupted, as it were. And they stormed across. They went, pedal to the metal, didn't worry about supply lines. That was a big mistake. And then the Marines made their last opposed invasion in Incheon Harbor. Now, I've been in Incheon Harbor, and boy, it's got one heck of a tide. It comes in, and if you're not a fast walker, especially in mud, you're gonna be swimming or drowning very quickly. Anyway, they had to time it very precisely, because if they picked the wrong time, the tide would go out, and all the ships would be, a lot of them would be basically grounded before they even got to shore, and then the Marines would have had to, slog through the mud. But anyway, they fought their way ashore, and again, the North Koreans already had the news from the south, where their line around Busan, or Fusan as it's pronounced in Korea, was collapsing, again because of lack of supply and reinforcements. And from that point on, it was all over. And it was without the Chinese, who suffered tremendous casualties. I mean, the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, the frozen Chosin, I think cost the Chinese 2 divisions worth of troops lost. I mean, the Marines took heavy casualties, but they took their wounded and a lot of their dead with them. So they had a lot to be proud of there. It was quite an accomplishment. A lot of Army units and Allied units weren't so lucky. A lot of them got out, but a lot of them didn't. They just got surrounded and shot to pieces. Now, after that, it basically got stalemated along what the current, roughly where the current DMZ, the militarized zone, is. The Chinese made another offensive. I think they temporarily occupied Seoul again. That was the capital city of South Korea. They were pushed out. And it was trench warfare. It was World War I all over again. One of my uncles was on a troop ship, several days out of Korea. He was in the infantry, a mortar man, and I guess they heard he was coming because they signed the armistice, before he hit the Korea, and he spent the rest of his tour, 1-year tour, trying not to get killed by the Slicky Boys. These were the sneak thieves who, by the time I got there 10 years later, were no longer pulling knives on troops and driving trucks, but they were stealing anything they could lay their hands on. South Korea was in very bad shape economically up until, I guess, the 80s and 80s. And what really changed both Koreas, well, North Korea in particular, forever, was Kim, the founder of the Kim Dynasty. He outlived the Soviet Union. He died in 1994. While the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and with that, all the countries that were basically getting by with subsidies, very generous, oil, cash, food subsidies from Russia, like Cuba, for example, suddenly, went through a decade of very, very strenuous economic struggle. The Koreans call that decade the arduous march, because Kim basically rallied. His son rallied his son was basically his understudy for a decade before he took over in 94. But between the two of them, they made the Korean people believe that they were overcoming not a communist defeat, but a test of juche. And that's a Korean term meaning self-reliance. Now, that's an old Korean term which gets taken out of the closet every once in a while. It originally went back to times when Korea was caught between an aggressive China, or an imperial China, and an aggressive Japan. And they tried as best they could to keep them out. In fact, at one point, the United States sent a landing party ashore. There was some sort of dispute. That isolation basically kept them from adopting modern weapons and what have you. So they were unable to stop the Americans. They did whatever they had to do. I figured exactly what it was, and then they withdrew. But in 1950, the only thing that saved the North Korean government was the timely arrival of the Chinese. Now, something that has only become news, as it were, documented after the Soviet Union fell and China opened up a bit, was that China told Russia, our debt is paid. In other words, all the aid that the Russians had given the Chinese communists during the 30s, especially, and the invasion that drove the Japanese out of Manchuria and turned it over to the Chinese. They appreciated that, but the Chinese still had claims on a lot of Russia's Pacific Coast territories, and they very how should I put it? Obviously, did not withdraw those claims, especially after Korea. So Russia was on notice. It's only a matter of time before we come back and regain our lost territories. In fact, they're doing that right now because not many Russians want to live on the Pacific coast. It's cold, very cold, sort of like the northern New England, the Maine coast. Cold, snow, and it's not a pleasant place, for 3 or 4 months of the year. After the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of the people who had been coerced into moving to the Far East, Vladivostok, and what have you, headed back to the Western Russia, where there were more economic opportunities. Living wasn't so austere, and the Chinese moved in. I mean, basically, they came in first as traders. There was a labor shortage. Hey, Chinese, hey, if you can do the work at lower wages, you're welcome. And bit by bit, they began taking over the economy. And of course, the Chinese adopted a market economy in the 1980s, late 70s. And by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, the Chinese were getting much more prosperous. They were turning out goods that Russia didn't turn out at all. They had a lot of their industry right there. They could ship it to Far Eastern Russia, cheaper. And so bit by bit, they are conquering their disputed territories, demographically and economically. So when the time comes for the Chinese to say we're taking over, there won't be much of a fight because there won't be many Russians left out there. The Russians still can't get anybody. In fact, they hire a lot of Koreans at cut rates. The North Korea keeps 90% of the wages, but the other 10% is more than they'd ever make in Korea. And because North Korea shut down its borders in January 2020 for the COVID, and they're still down. They've allowed more imports lately, but nobody's getting in or nobody's getting out. In fact, recently the Russians, one of the few countries that maintain their embassies in North Korea, evacuated most of them because it was privation even for people with semi-hard currency like the Russians. And the North Koreans have been having a very hard time. They keep insisting that there's never been any COVID-19 in North Korea, but it is in there. It just isn't spreading a lot. And that's mainly because the shutdown also shut down a lot of the internal transportation. The railroads, trucks, you name it. You have a hard time traveling. It's like going from one county province to another is like going to a foreign country. And it's usually not allowed except in extraordinary circumstances. So the legacy of the Kims, we're on the third generation now with Kim Jong-un, the grandson of the founder. And he's in weak health. He lost about 30, 40 pounds recently. He was very overweight, which was a bad image, for a country that's still full of very thin and undernourished people. They lost 10% of the population to starvation during the 1990s, the arduous march, as it were. And indeed, it was noticed, 20 years later, when those children born in North Korea during the 1990s got drafted at 18 for 6 to 10 years. Some of them showed up on the DMZ, on the areas, the Peace Village, where they have talks and what have you, and where they can watch each other. The South Koreans couldn't help but notice that their soldiers were a lot bigger and buffer, because they had been eating much better than ever before in South Korea, and they were like easily, half a foot taller, and much more imposing than the North Koreans. North Koreans couldn't help but notice that. But what's really killing the dynasty is video. Video didn't just kill the video star; it basically killed the Kim Dynasty, because up until the 1990s or 2000, the media was very strictly controlled in North Korea. There was one radio station. If you were caught with a radio, or heaven forbid, a shortwave radio, but the local radio stations only had one station, and that was the state-approved station. But bit by bit, first the people living along the Chinese border got Chinese cell phones. It was a felony to get caught with one, although things were getting so bad that if you had enough cash, especially Chinese or American cash, you could pay a bribe. It'd be expensive, but you wouldn't go to a labor camp, which is often a death sentence. It's like COVID with heavy labor. And, the news got in, because once people inside North Korea got it, you had the gossip net. People would talk. But what made it worse was people began bringing across videos. Now, at first they were on CDs and USB sticks, but eventually they started bringing them in on the micro SD cards, used in cameras. And these things, year by year could carry more and more, gigabytes. And they were cheap. And they basically get to a distributor in North Korea who would then duplicate them in media, USB, or a lot of people had DVD players, and they could play music or video and whatever, most of it unapproved. And they began to see that what they've been told all these years was that North Korea is more prosperous than the South. They couldn't believe the rise. It was like, the man in the high tower. What is this mythical world that, we were told was different? And they saw all these pictures of Seoul, what do you call it? The entertainment, what do you call it? The Korean rock, the K-rock.
K-pop fans.
K-pop. Which even the Kim Jong-un is a big fan of. He tried to create his own, and he declared it, I think it's now a capital crime, to be caught watching video of South Korean K-pop. You want North Korean K-pop. But they could never compete. I mean, they turned out some fairly decent acts. But again, they were, South Korea was a free country, better educated, better fed. More people were employed in basically real jobs. In North Korea, it was still the old adage, the state pays us to pretend to work, pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. So very low productivity. The solution, which the Kims were not happy with, was they bit by bit had to allow free markets. Now these were controlled. They had to pay taxes. But you wouldn't be shut down by the police. You wouldn't get shipped off to a labor camp. So there were incentives to make them work. But then in the last 10 years, the police have become greedy because they weren't getting paid much. And food and fuel, and especially in the winter, was much more expensive. So they demanded higher bribes. The smuggling of people, especially out of North Korea and along the Chinese border, became more and more of a problem. They couldn't really stop it. They tried to slow it down. I mean, there's nearly 40,000 North Koreans have ended up in South Korea. A lot of them don't really want to go to North Korea, the United States. They're quite content to live in northeastern China. There's a large millions of ethnic Koreans living in that part of China. They still speak Korean, and they'll basically, they'll hire their kinsmen from North Korea. And the government will tolerate them as long as they pay taxes and basically supply the MSI, the intelligence services, Chinese intelligence, with any information they're receiving from Korea. The Chinese have maintained a very accurate and voluminous intelligence collection activity in North Korea. Kim Jong-un was very well aware of this, and he was afraid that the Chinese knew so much about what was going on in North Korea and who was who and who could be relied on to support the Chinese and who would side with the Kims, that he was very vulnerable to a coup. So one of the first things he did when he took over in 2011 was to fire a lot of the older, generals and officials, including his uncle, married to his elder sister, or his father's sister, because they seemed too cozy with the Chinese. That may or may not have been true, but he basically replaced a generation of loyalists, old elderly loyalists, with younger men and a few women, like his younger sister, who's currently his heir apparent, mainly for their loyalty. I mean, a lot of them had better, more skills. They were more open to, modern ideas, as it were. But the problem was the old command economy was gone, and they had to reckon with this new class of donju. These are legal entrepreneurs. These guys, and a lot of them are women, are getting very rich. They're having trouble hanging on to the money because the North Korean government keeps trying to pass laws to force them to keep their hard currency in North Korean banks, which is a license to have it stolen by the government when they make a change in the exchange rate or whatever. They've done it several times. So the government banking system has no credibility, and neither does the government. So really, it's basically lurching along. The North Koreans, or East Asians in general, they don't rebel. They're a collective society. I mean, they're how should I put it? Culturally very different. I mean, actually, these differences exist around the world. Many cultures are collectivist, where the collective, as it were, is supreme over the individual. But countries like the United States, the British colonies, are more individualistic because basically they sent people out there not as press ganged, colonizers as the Spanish often did, but as individuals, and that became part of the American ethos. This every man, every woman, can basically make their own way, and this made a big difference. And in East Asia, the collectivism is very strong. There are rebellions, but when they come, they're massive. And the North Korea, this Chinese government and the North Korean government are afraid of this. But the bright side of this very high poverty rates, food shortages, transportation, shutdowns, and a very ruthless secret police, even though they'll take bribes, they will basically kill, literally, in order to hang on to their power and their relative affluence. There has not been, any real danger of a popular uprising. I mean, a lot of people are unhappy, but there's no way to organize and for example, there's no free internet. I mean, most people, if they get any access to the internet, it's the North Korean internet, which is an intranet. It doesn't allow you to dial out beyond North Korea, so it's very limited. And they have Chinese censoring software to keep track of who's saying naughty things and who's saying nice things. And basically, you adapt to this. The Stockholm syndrome on steroids with a touch of mercury poisoning, and it's a tragic situation. And the South Koreans, when they saw what happened in Germany, when the two Germanys reunited, the East had developed a very different culture from West Germany, more collectivist, more tolerant of central, a strong government control of everything, and this basically had brought East Germany to the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, they were basically unable to supply themselves and what have you. That's one reason why the Berlin Wall came down in '89, because a lot of even the German police, security forces, were not willing to kill their fellow Germans to preserve all this poverty, which wasn't getting any better. And they saw what was happening elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And the Germans had indeed rebelled in the 1950s, put down ruthlessly, as it were, by the Russians. That didn't stop the Hungarians from doing it later in the 50s, and then the Czechs, and then the Poles threatened seriously in the 80s to stage another rebellion. So they saw the writing on the wall. But there's no such thing in Korea. They were totally cut off from the outside world. They knew nothing about history except what the government told them, and the government told them a fairy tale. And when they found out the fairy tale was false, they were dispirited, but nobody was inspired to, revolution, let's change this. And so the South Koreans have concluded that will cost them a lot more per capita than it cost the Germans to merge the two, halves of the country. North Korea has been much more crippled psychologically and economically and educationally than the two Germanys were during the decades of separation. So it's a very grim situation in North Korea. I mean, we report it, regularly, and we just come up, we basically concentrate on the new ways it's coming apart. Question is, how long can it hang together? The basic problem is there's the only way a revolution is going to happen. It's going to come from the security services. And they basically are kept on a tight leash. And that's why the Koreans are very fearful that the Chinese will eventually exercise their options in North Korea, where they have a lot of people who are loyal to China. They see what's happening in China. They wouldn't basically object to China helping facilitate a change of government in Korea, with Koreans running the show, not Chinese. But the Chinese basically haven't pulled that trigger because that basically sets a bad precedent. They're in enough trouble in the South China Sea and with all their other border disputes. It's not really worth their while to get involved in quicksand in North Korea. So there it is. It's a bad situation. It is a dynasty, and it's a dynasty which is approaching the revolution or the collapse. That would be more appropriate description of it, because there's not likely to be a revolution, but there will be a total collapse, anarchy, and at that point, South Korea said they will go in and liberate and feed and help their Korean brothers, and the Chinese are saying, if you want to get nuked or you want to get invaded by China, if you don't want to have that happen to you, then don't go in. So that's unresolved. So it's still a flashpoint potentially, but so far it's just been a slow motion mudslide.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. Austin, so are we in for another 70 years of North Korea and South Korea as it stands right now?
Well, excuse me, Dan. That's a good transition, Dan, because it's Afghanistan isn't the longest war that the United States involved in. It's the Korean War, which is still an armistice. Jim sort of sketched it that we've got a ceasefire from 1953, really a complicated one between UN forces, meaning really the United States, and what we had a fairly large allied contingent fighting with us, and South Korea and North Korea, and there's an armistice commission that meets on a regular basis. Except there was a period, wasn't there, Jim, on and off for about 20 years where North Korea boycotted it. I think that was part of it. They were,
they used negotiating tactics similar to
right. But they do have them, and they meet in Panmunjom, which is the quote unquote UN peace village. I've been up there. It's a really interesting place, and Dan, Jim's description of the difference between North Korean and South Korean troops is accurate. It's really stark. Plus, the other addition is the U.S. Army MPs up there. All of them look like they were playing tight end in high school, and they're tall, big, and part of it's for show. It's definitely for show. I'm tell this quickly. When I was up there, I got to talking to Sergeant E5 MP, and I mentioned to him what I had noticed with about the North Korean soldiers, and also the size of the South Korean soldiers and MPs. And he started chuckling, and he says, "Yes, sir." Yes, sir. That's part of what we do, and it's okay. A little competition there on on the size and shape of the soldiers. That, by the way, the South Korean assigned to Panmunjom, they are just some of the sharpest looking soldiers I've ever seen. The North Koreans, you watch their eyes. They're not supposed to look at the visitors, but they really enjoy looking at the Japanese and American and Australian women. You can see that as well, which gets back to the K-pop invasion, the Korean pop music, but especially the girl bands. And that's what they call them, the girl bands. They have been quite successful and really throughout Asia, from India on up through China. During when they've had some political contretemps, the Chinese don't allow South Korean bands to come and appear in mainland China. And I'll close. The only people that really get ticked off are the Chinese fans of these Korean bands. South Korea's made a lot of money, both from its from the music and from the films they shoot. They've got a very vibrant arts and entertainment industry, and plenty of those DVDs and CDs have gotten north. As a matter of fact, I read this about 3 years ago, that one of the hottest items in North Korean military units were DVDs of South Korean girl K-pop bands. Of course, they're forbidden by the dictatorship, but I don't think they were too successful in stopping 19-year-old boys from looking at those rock and roll DVDs. So let me talk for a second, though, about the potential for a blow up instead of just 70 years of sliding into into a pit. That's what Jim said, and that's meaning North Korea. First of all, South Korea, let's see, I think it was 2010, 2011, started its reunification fund. Now, this reason I'm starting there is that the reunification fund was also a statement about, we're not going to try to start a war. But we know what bad shape you're in, and we're not going to suffer the economic consequences that West Germany did when it absorbed East Germany. Now, Jim mentioned that. It took West Germany roughly from 1990 at reunification to 2005, 2006, and you can see this on some studies about it, to pay for the absorption of East Germany. And West Germany had, I think, 64, 65 million people. East Germany, about 15 million. And more land area. And East Germany had one of the highest GDPs and quality of lifestyle in Eastern Europe. But it took 15 years. North Korea is the cesspool that Jim describes. You've got, the royalty and the Kim Dynasty and some of their generals and security personnel that live like kings and princes, and the rest of the country is paupers, serfs. They're miserable. And it doesn't have any infrastructure. The only infrastructure that it's got has been modernized is that there are some roads that South Korea paid for to go up to the Kaesong special economic area, where South Korea built a factory complex to for North Korean workers to work in and produce South Korean products. And there are some of that superhighway does go further north towards Pyongyang. But railroads, during the thaw, early part of the Trump administration, after Trump had met with Kim Jong-un, South Korea, North Korea let South Korea put a special train together to go and look at all the track, at least on the East Coast and partly on the West Coast, to determine what kind of shape it was in, with the idea that South Korea would eventually help North Korea modernize its rail system. And I followed this story over a period of about 2 months. There were places that train, even though it had cars and workers supporting it so they could put in track, it just had to stop because it was miserable. And these were quote unquote main lines of main rail lines in North Korea. So here you've got this pot of money that's been building now for 10 or 11 years. South Korea originally thought they were going to need in 2010, 2011 dollars, about 3 trillion, maybe 5 trillion. Now, calculations on what it would actually cost to fix up North Korea on that they may need to double it. And that's an astronomical amount of money, even for a wealthy country like South Korea, to spend on rebuilding the North. They don't want to sacrifice their lifestyle. And South Korea is really a quite modern country now. They worked hard. They're creative. They got great research and development institutions. And they don't want to what's the population now? I think it's 52 or 53 million in South Korea, and it's 20 something in North Korea. So you've got a huge population imbalance. But that, and also North Korea is a little bit larger in land area, but they don't want to sacrifice what they've built, what they've earned. Now, North Korea's game. Jim and I have talked about this, and you see it in our books too. That chapter I've got in Cocktails from Hell on North Korea goes into how the Kim clan uses crime to really pay for their luxury items. Selling drugs, all various types of organized crime, including human smuggling. But their biggest game is nuclear threat, which they've been working on nuclear weapons at least since the early 1990s. If you go back and look at 1994 in the Clinton administration, we were supposed to have reached an agreement, the U.S. and North Korea, that North Korea wasn't going to get a bomb. Of course, that's was a charade and a lie on North Korea's part. They've continued to develop their ballistic missile program and some of the cruise missile program. Jim's followed this in How to Make War sections, as well as the Korea updates. And they've even improved to the point that they've got some missiles that are solid fuel and certainly large with enough range that they could put a nuclear weapon or a conventional weapon on Japan and probably hit Guam. So They're also to a point that their longer range ICBMs bring the Hawaii and parts of Alaska, British Columbia, and parts of the U.S. West Coast, certainly the Washington State, within range of a North Korean attack. And blackmail instrument. That's what I say is its primary purpose. Pay us off, or we'll shoot you. And then, of course, they're assuring themselves their own destruction. It's a what used to be called a Mexican standoff with two vaqueros pointing six guns at each other at the range of 6 feet. Who's going to shoot first? But they're both going to go. They're both going to go down, or at least they're both going to suffer. So the change that has occurred, and it's unclear how this is going to play out over the next 2 or 3 years, is that Kim Jong-un actually came out of his bunker in responding to the Trump administration's first coercive diplomacy, and then Trump telling him, and I'm being a bit facetious here, but this was basically the U.S. offer: do you want condominium apartments, or do you want craters? Meaning that's your choice there. Now, South Korea and Japan, even though they go through little short periods of disagreement that have to do with rivalries and ethnic tensions that are at least 500-600 years old, but they really have cooperated on producing conventional capabilities that can decapitate a potential North Korean missile strike of any type. Chinese spend a lot of time and a lot of effort spying on North Korea. So does South Korea and Japan, doing the same thing for a slightly different reason, their own security. The threat that North Korea would also hold over South Korea is all their conventional artillery. Now, a lot of it is sited within 20 kilometers of the demilitarized zone, and it's rocket and long-range tube, but they can fire really into the northern third of Seoul. Seoul is really a huge city, it spreads out like Los Angeles or Houston, but the northern tier of it is within conventional artillery and rocket artillery range. So North Korea's another part of its blackmail over the South is, even if we don't develop a nuclear weapon, we can destroy Seoul again. And Seoul is I forget the exact number, but the Seoul area from Chonan up through Seoul, running over to Incheon, produces something like 65% of South Korea's GDP. So a lot of money. It may be a little more than that, but depends on how you map that economic footprint in South Korea. So South Korea and Japan have developed. South Koreans refer to it as their kill chain. Weapon systems, most of them air delivered. They're missile and aircraft that can take out or close the hardened artillery sites that are most of them are on the reverse slope of the ridges on the north of the DMZ, and they've been hard to target. But now they've got cruise missiles and some missiles that are on the verge of having hypersonic speeds that can come in from the rear and hit the entrances to these caves, these tunnels where the North Koreans have located their artillery pieces and rocket systems. That's very complicated, but they exercise it, and I think they could do it. Nevertheless, the North Koreans have devoted a lot of time to keeping that threat in place. Do I think North Korea is actually going to pull the trigger? No, I don't. But they want everybody to think they're going to pull the trigger. And the South is tired of paying them. As a matter of fact, it went through a period where they're not absolutely minimal aid other than food and medicine. They do that. The same thing with Japan. North Korea, it presents a problem. It presents a real threat, but at the same time, this is the contradiction here. The big blow up is a very unlikely threat, and that gets down to when does the collapse come? Jim did a good job of covering that. We don't know. We know that the South Koreans don't want to see a collapse. The Chinese really don't want to see a collapse because the Chinese want a buffer state between South Korea, Japan, and their border. But at some point, it's going to happen. I don't think it'll be 70 years, Dan, but I don't think it's in the next 5 or 6 either.
Okay. Well, we're at the end of our time. That's a good place to wrap it up. And we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.